The wind came first, fierce and dry, carrying grit across the prairie until it stung the skin. Clouds rolled heavy over the horizon, and the cattle had gone restless, bawling as though they sensed what approached. He had stepped out to fasten the barn doors when he saw her, half collapsed against the fence post, barefoot, mud-streaked. Her dress tore into ribbons by the storm and the road. She clutched the post like a drowning soul clings to driftwood, eyes hollow yet still alive enough to whisper, barely audible over the wind, "Don't look at me." He froze, the words cutting deeper than any shout could. The rancher had known silence for years, ever since death carved its mark on his house. He'd grown accustomed to the steady rhythm of cattle bells, the soft cry of his little girl, and the weight of loneliness that filled the wide spaces between. But this was different. A stranger stood on his land, bleeding, shivering, begging not for help but for invisibility. He didn't answer. Speech had long deserted him. But he stepped closer, his boots crunching against gravel, slow and deliberate, so she wouldn't bolt like a spooked colt. Her hair clung to her face in damp strands. One cheek bore a dark bruise that told its story without words. She tried to retreat, but her knees buckled, sending her to the dirt. He dropped to one knee beside her, and though his lips did not move, his eyes told her he had no intention of turning away. His calloused hands hovered before touching her arm, steady yet gentle, as though asking permission. She flinched but did not pull away. For a long moment, nothing stirred but the storm above and her ragged breath. He gathered her up in his arms. She weighed less than a sack of grain, frighteningly frail, yet her body trembled with a hidden fire, fear, fury, something he couldn't name. As he carried her toward the barn, she whispered again, weaker now, "Don't look." He didn't, not in the way she meant. He didn't stare at her torn clothes or the dirt on her skin. He only kept his eyes on the door ahead, on the lantern's faint glow within, where warmth and water and shelter waited. The air inside smelled of hay and leather. He set her on a pile of fresh straw, draped a wool blanket over her, and struck a match to light the lantern. She winced at the sudden glow, shrinking from it as though light itself were dangerous. He noticed the soles of her feet, blistered and raw, marked by days of walking. His jaw tightened, but still he said nothing. His silence was not coldness. It was the only way he knew to keep the past from spilling out. She peered at him, suspicion battling gratitude in her gaze. Why are you helping me?" Her voice cracked on the edges, brittle as glass. He poured water into a tin cup and offered it without answer. She studied him as though expecting a trap, then took it with trembling fingers. The water dribbled down her chin, soaking into the blanket. When she finished, she pressed the cup back to his chest, almost defiantly, as if daring him to demand repayment. He didn't. He set the cup aside, knelt again, and carefully began cleaning the gash on her arm with a rag. She hissed in pain, her breath sharp as a knife. But she didn't pull away. "Why won't you say anything?" she whispered after a while, her eyes narrowing. His hands paused for a fraction of a second, then resumed their work. He didn't need to speak for her to see the shadow behind his silence. She tilted her head, almost regretful, and sank deeper into the straw. Her lids grew heavy, exhaustion weighing her down. The rancher rose, his frame casting a long shadow across the lantern's glow. He moved to the doorway and scanned the open range. The storm had not fully broken yet, but lightning forked against the dark sky, illuminating movement at the ridge. Shapes of men on horseback, small against the vastness but unmistakable. His hand went instinctively to the rifle prop by the doorframe. The woman stirred as though she, too, felt the danger crawling closer. "They're coming!" she rasped, her voice no longer faint but urgent, carrying the dread of someone hunted for too long. He didn't turn to face her. His eyes locked on the horizon, steady as stone, while his thumb traced the worn wood of the rifle stock. Thunder rolled, closer now, masking the drum of hooves. He extinguished the lantern, plunging the barn into darkness except for thin cracks of moonlight seeping through the slats. Behind him, she curled into herself, clutching the blanket like a shield. He took one step forward, then another, and stood watch at the doorway, silent guardian of a stranger who had stumbled, broken and barefoot, into his world. Outside, the riders descended the ridge. They weren't here by accident. Dawn broke with a pale wash of gold across the valley. softening the rugged outlines of the ranch. The night had passed without intrusion, though the distant riders had not vanished from memory. The woman stirred on the straw, blinking at the muted light spilling through the cracks. Her body ached, but for the first time in days she wasn't running. She shifted beneath the blanket and studied a man who sat nearby, sharpening a knife with slow, deliberate strokes. His silence unnerved her, yet it felt strangely safer than words could. Words had always been twisted against her, but his quiet carried weight, not menace. She gathered courage to speak, her voice fragile but steady. "You should have left me out there. It would have been easier." He glanced up, eyes steady, then returned to the blade, dragging the stone along its edge in a rhythm that soothed more than it threatened. Easier, perhaps, but not right. That truth hung between them, without needing to be spoken. Her thoughts drifted backward, against her will. She had been a wife once, proud to wear a ring, believing it meant safety. Her husband had been a kind man, but kindness was no shield against the greed of others. His death had come sudden, a so-called accident near the mill, though whispers said otherwise. With him gone, the roof above her had been claimed by another, an overseer with hands like iron and eyes that measured women as one measures livestock. Her days blurred into years of servitude, of bruises hidden under sleeves, of silence forced down her throat. Escape had been a dream, until desperation gave her the courage to steal away into the night. Yet dreams demanded payment, and her payment was the body she had dragged through dust and thorn until she collapsed at the stranger's land. She clenched her hands now, nails biting into her palms, ashamed of the weakness that memory awakened. "You don't know what kind of trouble I bring," she murmured, almost to herself. The rancher set the knife aside and rose, tall in the dim light, his boots whispering against the floor. He fetched a small bundle of bread and jerky, setting it near her without ceremony. His eyes flickered toward her bandaged arm, then back to her face. He knew trouble when he saw it. He also knew running from it was no cure. From outside came the high-pitched laughter of a child, quick and bright as birdsong. The woman stiffened, clutching the blanket tighter. Then the barn door creaked open, and a little girl burst inside, hair wild, cheeks flushed with morning chill. She halted mid-stride at the sight of the stranger, eyes widening. The woman froze, not knowing whether to hide or greet. But the child's surprise melted into curiosity. She stepped closer, tilting her head. "Papa, who's this?" The rancher's jaw tightened. He gave no answer, only rested a hand gently on his daughter's shoulder. The woman swallowed the lump rising in her throat. Children were innocents, and innocence made her fear sharper. She forced a smile that trembled at the corners. "Just someone passing through," she whispered, though the words scraped against her lie. The girl grinned anyway, bold in the way only the young could be. "You look tired. Papa makes the best coffee. Well, it's strong. He says it'll put hair on your chest. I think that's silly." Despite herself, the woman let out a small laugh, thin but genuine. It startled her as much as it startled the rancher. She hadn't laughed in months, maybe years. The girl's presence chipped at the fortress she'd built around herself. But fear quickly reclaimed its ground. What if the riders found her here? What would they do to this child? She looked away, unable to bear the thought. Later, when the girl had run off to chase chickens, the woman turned back to the rancher. "You've got someone to lose," she said softly. His stillness was answer enough. She watched the way his gaze lingered on the doorway where his daughter had vanished, and in that gaze she saw the weight of memory. He had once loved a woman deeply. That much was clear. Loss had silenced him, locked his voice away like a prisoner in his own chest. The barn fell quiet except for the rustle of straw. She whispered, almost to test him, "What was her name?" For the first time, his eyes flinched. He looked down, hands tightening into fists, then released attention with a slow exhale. His silence screamed louder than words. She did not press further. Some wounds were too raw to touch. Still, the air between them shifted. She no longer felt only like a burden. She felt like someone staring into a mirror darkened by years of sorrow. Her pain had been inflicted from without, his from within, but grief had carved both of them hollow. That recognition bound them more tightly than any conversation could. The day passed with uneasy calm. She helped where she could, brushing straw, fetching water, though her body threatened to fold with every effort. Each small act, though, reminded her she was still capable of more than running. The rancher didn't thank her, but he didn't stop her either. In his quiet acceptance, she found a fragile dignity returning. When evening came, the valley seemed too still, as though the land itself held its breath. From the ridge, faint dust clouds rose once more. The woman spotted them first, her stomach turning to ice. Shapes of horses, too many for comfort, winding down the trail. Her voice shook when she spoke. "They've found me." The rancher followed her gaze, face unreadable, then moved with measured calm. He checked the rifle, tested the weight of the bullets in his palm, and leaned the weapon within reach. The little girl, unaware of the danger, sang to herself outside. The woman's chest constricted at the sound. She wanted to run again, to spare them this, but her legs wouldn't move, perhaps because she had no strength left, or perhaps because something in her longed, desperately, for someone who would not let her face the darkness alone. The rancher's eyes met hers across the barn, steady, unflinching. His silence spoke again. "Stay." She nodded, trembling, torn between terror and trust. Night settled over the valley, bringing with it the promise of confrontation. The riders were not strangers anymore. They were a shadow stretching closer, and the shadow was nearly at the door. The first knock wasn't a knock at all, but the scrape of boots against gravel outside the house. The woman stiffened where she sat, her breath catching as shadows passed the windows. The rancher stood in the doorway, rifle already in hand, his body carved into the stillness of a man who had been waiting for this moment far too long. Lantern light flickered over his jaw, set like stone. The little girl's humming faltered, sensing the shift in the air. Silence stretched, taut as a lasso pulled tight. Then came the real knock, sharp, deliberate, mocking. A voice drawled through the wood, oily and smug. "Evening, friend. We're looking for a stray. Woman ran off, belongs to us. You ain't seen her, have you?" The woman's fingernails dug into her palms. Belongs. The word made by a rise in her throat. She turned to the rancher, desperate, terrified he might betray her with silence. He didn't flinch. He didn't move at all, except to steady his rifle. The door creaked as another shove rattled it on its hinges. "Open up, rancher. Sheriff's orders. Best not make trouble where there ain't none." Her heart dropped at the word sheriff. If the law was with them, there was no refuge left. But still he didn't answer, didn't surrender her name. Instead, he pressed a finger to his lips in a rare, commanding gesture, telling her without sound that fear mustn't speak louder than steel. The latch gave way under a boot, and the door swung open. Men spilled into the room, dusty coats, revolvers at their sides, grins that reeked of cruelty. Their eyes found her instantly, curled in the corner with a blanket clutched tight. "There she is," one said, triumphant. "Thought you could hide, sweetheart?" Before the man's hand could reach her, the crack of the rifle split the air. A jar shattered on the shelf behind him, splinters of glass raining down. The rancher had fired a warning shot, not a kill, but the room froze all the same. Smoke coiled from the barrel, and his stance dared anyone to move. The leader smirked, though his eyes flickered with unease. "You don't want to do this, friend. You got a kid here. Would be a shame if—" The rest of the threat never left his mouth. Another shot rang out, quicker, sharper, grazing his hat clean off his head. The man stumbled back, cursing. Chaos ignited. Revolvers cleared their holsters, gunfire sparking against the walls. The woman ducked, ears ringing, vision narrow in the flashes of light, and the acrid sting of powder. The little girl screamed from behind the table, hands over her ears. The rancher moved with lethal precision, each shot measured, each breath calm in the storm. Still, a bullet grazed his arm, tearing fabric and flesh. He staggered, only for a heartbeat, then steadied himself again. She couldn't just sit there. The sight of him bleeding jolted something inside her, a fire hotter than fear. Crawling across the floor, she dragged the child into her arms, shielding her small body as splinters of wood flew from shattered furniture. Her pulse thundered in her skull, but she forced herself to look, to see where the men moved. One of them circled toward the girl, knife drawn. Her throat tightened. Without thinking, she grabbed the iron poker from the hearth and swung with every ounce of fury she had left. The crack against his forearm was sickening. He dropped the knife with a howl, clutching his arm, and she kicked it across the floor out of reach. The rancher's eyes flicked toward her, just for a second, acknowledging her courage. It was enough to steady her trembling hands. She wasn't only prey anymore. She was fighting. The gunfire ebbed as quickly as it had erupted. Smoke clouded the room, acrid and choking. 3 men lay groaning on the floorboards, wounded, one unconscious. But the leader hadn't fallen. He stood at the threshold, panting, his revolver pressed against the temple of the rancher's daughter. The girl whimpered, tears cutting streaks through the soot on her cheeks. "Enough!" the man barked, voice ragged with desperation. "You put the rifle down or the girl dies." The rancher froze, weapon still raised. His face was carved with fury, so deep it looked almost calm. The woman clutched the poker, her chest heaving. Every instinct screamed to rush forward, but one wrong move would end the child. She looked at him, the man who had carried her from the dirt, who had shielded her with nothing but silence and strength. His jaw worked, teeth clenched, and for the first time since she had met him, he parted his lips as if words might come. They didn't. Not yet. His silence was his weapon still. The leader sneered, pressing the gun harder against the girl's head. "She don't matter to me. You think she'll matter to anyone if you're dead?" The woman's heart clawed at her ribs. She shifted her grip on the poker, sweat slicking her palms. The rancher's gaze locked with hers. In that look, a plan unspoken passed between them. One distraction, one chance. The little girl whimpered again, "Papa." The word fractured the room, slicing through the smoke and fear. The rancher's hands trembled, but he steadied them, rifle still aimed, eyes narrowing to slits. He didn't speak, couldn't speak, but his stare promised violence swift as lightning if the man dare harm her. The standoff stretched into eternity. Sweat rolled down the leader's brow, his bravado cracking under the weight of silence, of 2 pairs of eyes, one hardened, one defiant, fixing him in place. The storm outside howled through the cracks, rattling the shutters as though the land itself bore witness. And then, with a sharp motion, the rancher lowered the rifle, just enough to make the man's grin return. The woman seized the instant. She flung the poker with all her strength. It struck his wrist, the revolver clattering to the floor. The rancher lunged forward, rifle raised again. The child broke free, scrambling into her father's arms. The leader snarled, reaching for the fallen gun, but the rancher's boot pinned it down, barrel level between the man's eyes. The room stilled again, but this time the power had shifted. The silence that followed was thick, dangerous, a silence that said the next move would be his last. The woman clutched the girl, both of them shaking, eyes locked on the rancher. He hadn't spoken, not a single word, yet his presence roared louder than any threat. Blood dripped from his arm, but he stood unyielding, protector of both child and stranger alike. The leader swallowed hard, lips curling into a bitter smile. "This ain't finished," he spat, backing away slowly, his men dragging themselves toward the door. "You've just bought yourself a war." The rancher didn't move, didn't lower the rifle, not until the last hoofbeat faded into the night. Only then did he let out a breath, ragged and low, his shoulders sinking under the weight of what was to come. The woman held the child tight, her own chest heaving, her eyes finding his in the smoky half-light. For the first time, she wasn't just afraid of being hunted. She was afraid of what their enemies might unleash next, and yet a part of her felt steadier than it had in years, because she knew this man, silent and scarred, would not let her face it alone. The night after the raid was thick with smoke and dread, every board in the house creaking like it knew what was coming. The wounded men had fled with their leader, but their threats clung to the air long after their hoofbeats faded. The woman cleaned the rancher's arm by lantern light, hands trembling as she pressed cloth to the bleeding gash. He didn't wince, though sweat dampened his brow. His little girl sat curled against his side, thumb tucked in her mouth, too weary to cry any more. The woman whispered as she worked, "They'll come back. Men like that don't forgive. And you," she faltered, eyes burning with fear, "you should have let me go." His silence was steady, unyielding. He hadn't let her go the first night, and nothing in his gaze suggested he would now. She turned away, cursing the weakness that made her want to keep holding her here, where safety felt almost real. Days passed with uneasy quiet. The woman worked alongside him, tending cattle, mending fences, though her gaze often drifted to the ridge. Every shadow seemed a rider, every gust of dust a threat returning. Yet, with each shared chore, a fragile rhythm grew between them. The little girl laughed louder, tugging the woman's hand, asking her to braid her hair or tell stories. In those small moments, the woman remembered pieces of herself she thought were lost forever. The storm broke one evening when the sun bled red over the horizon. The men came hard and fast, their torches blazing, their shouts echoing across the valley. Fire roared as they set the outer barn alight, sparks clawing upward into the twilight. The rancher thrust his daughter into the woman's arms and pointed toward the cellar door, a silent order to run. But she shook her head, clutching the child close, refusing to vanish while he stood alone. Gunfire cracked like thunder. The rancher moved through smoke and flame with ruthless precision, each shot a promise. The woman crouched low, heart hammering, whispering prayers she hadn't spoken since girlhood. A man broke through the haze, lunging toward her with a knife raised. She swung a pitchfork with desperate strength, steel sinking into his shoulder. His cries split the air, but he fell, and she pulled the child tighter to her chest. Fear still consumed her, but she was no longer only its prisoner. She was fighting for more than herself now. Through the chaos, she saw the leader striding toward the rancher, revolver gleaming. The rancher's rifle jammed on an empty chamber, and in that heartbeat the man seized his chance. Gun raised. Time slowed, dread suffocating. And then it happened. The rancher's voice, rough and broken from years of disuse, tore through the night. "Give me back my daughter." The words cracked like a whip, deep and thunderous, shocking even him. The leader faltered, eyes wide at the sound, just long enough for the rancher to slam the rifle, but into his jaw. The fight was brutal, hand to hand, fists and fury crashing against each other until the leader staggered back into the blaze. He spat blood, eyes wild, then fled into the dark with the last of his men, leaving the barn to burn behind them. When silence fell again, it was a silence of ash and ruin. The woman lowered the girl to the ground and rushed to the rancher, who stood swaying with exhaustion. Blood streaked across his face. She caught his arm, anchoring him, her own body shaking. For the first time since she had stumbled barefoot into his world, she saw his eyes soften, the hardness breaking at the edges. He looked at her, not through her, not past her, but at her, as though she were something more than trouble, more than a burden. Her tears spilled, unashamed, streaking her dirt-caked cheeks. She whispered, "You should have let me go." He shook his head slowly, voice hoarse but steady now. "I see you." Just 3 words, but they carried the weight of years buried in silence. Her throat closed with emotion, and she pressed her forehead against his chest, sobbing into the flannel stiff with sweat and smoke. They buried the dead at dawn, simple mounds on the far edge of the pasture. The girl skipped between them, too young to understand the gravity, her laughter a strange kind of grace among the graves. Life pushed forward, even in the shadow of loss. The woman stood beside the rancher, hand brushing his, neither pulling away. There was no talk of tomorrow, no promises etched in stone. But there was breath, there was quiet, there was a fragile seed of belonging. As the sun rose higher, painting the prairie gold, the woman lifted her gaze to the horizon. She no longer felt the same crushing weight in her chest. She had fled with nothing but fear, and now she stood with something like hope. The rancher's silence had broken, but his strength had not. The little girl laughed again, chasing a butterfly through the grass, her joy untouched by all that had burned. The narrator's voice lingers here, turning outward, not just to her, but to you. Think of the storms you've run through, the bruises carried unseen, the nights you whispered to yourself not to be looked at. Think of the voices buried in silence, waiting for the moment they break free. Every soul bears scars, but scars do not make you unworthy. They make you endured. They make you alive. And if this story moved you, Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments, because stories like these are not just told. They're carried forward, piece by piece, by those who see themselves reflected in their fire.